Let me ask you something before we start. When was the last time you had an argument with someone older than you? And no matter what you said, no matter how logical your point was, they just wouldn't budge. They looked at you like you were from a different planet. And honestly, you looked at them the same way. That tension you felt, that invisible wall, that's not just a generation gap. That's psychology. Deep, fascinating, complicated psychology. And today, we're going to get inside the minds of one of the most misunderstood generations in human history, the baby boomers. Now, before you roll your eyes and think, oh great, another video blaming old people for everything. Stop. That's not what this is. This is deeper. This is about understanding why they think the way they think, why they react the way they react, and honestly, why some of their patterns might be living inside you too, without you even knowing it. So let's go back, way back. Between 1946 and 1964, something massive happened. World War II had just ended. Soldiers came home. People were exhausted from years of fear, loss, and survival. And then, life exploded. Babies everywhere. Optimism everywhere. The world felt like it was finally breathing again. That wave of births, roughly 76 million in the United States alone, that's your baby boomer generation. But here's what most people miss. These weren't just babies born in peaceful times. These were children raised in one of the most psychologically intense periods of modern history. Think about it. They grew up watching their parents carry trauma they never talked about. War trauma, economic trauma, survival trauma. And yet nobody called it trauma back then. You just kept going. You didn't complain. You worked. That became the first psychological imprint on an entire generation. Silence equals strength. Struggle equals character. And if you feel pain, push through it, because life doesn't stop for feelings. Now fast forward a little. The 1950s and 60s. Baby boomers are kids and teenagers now. And the world around them is changing at a speed nobody had ever experienced before. Television is entering homes. Cold War paranoia is in the air. The civil rights movement is happening. Vietnam is happening. Political assassinations are happening. These kids didn't just watch history. They lived through it, protested it, bled for it. Here's the psychological twist, though. After all that chaos, after all that fighting for change, many of them eventually settled, got jobs, got mortgages, got comfortable. And psychologists call this something really interesting. They call it the idealism to pragmatism shift. You start as a rebel, you end as the system. Not because you're a sellout, but because survival has a way of reshaping priorities. And this is where the real psychology gets juicy. See, baby boomers developed what researchers describe as an extraordinarily strong work identity. Their job wasn't just their job, it was their entire self-concept. You are what you do. You are what you earn. You are what you've built. This isn't laziness disguised as ambition. This is deep psychological conditioning from watching their parents survive a Great Depression. Money was never guaranteed. Security was never guaranteed. So you work, you save, you don't spend frivolously. And you absolutely don't understand why younger generations are spending their savings on experiences instead of property. That right there, that specific conflict is one of the most psychologically loaded generational clashes happening right now in millions of families around the world. But let's go even deeper. Let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed enough, the emotional landscape of baby boomers. Most boomers grew up in households where emotional expression was not encouraged. Boys especially were taught that vulnerability is weakness. Girls were taught to be agreeable, nurturing, quiet. Therapy was for crazy people. Mental health conversations simply did not exist in polite company. You had a problem, you prayed, you worked harder, or you buried it. The long-term psychological consequence of this? An entire generation that is genuinely skilled at compartmentalization, at pushing feelings down and functioning at a high level despite internal chaos. Now, on one hand, incredible resilience. On the other hand, a generation that sometimes struggles to recognize emotional needs in themselves and in others. A generation that might see your anxiety as weakness because they never had the language to recognize their own anxiety as valid. This isn't cruelty, this is the psychological architecture they were given. And speaking of psychological architecture, let's talk about something called locus of control. Psychologists use this to describe whether a person believes their life is shaped by their own choices or by external forces beyond their control. Baby boomers, on average, were raised with a strongly internal locus of control. You work hard, you succeed. Simple equation. And they genuinely believed it because many of them lived it. Post-war economic booms created real upward mobility. A man with a high school diploma could buy a house, raise a family, retire comfortably. That was real. So when they look at younger generations and say, just work harder, they're not being deliberately dismissive. They're applying a formula that actually worked for them. The psychological blind spot is that they sometimes don't fully account for how dramatically the economic and social landscape has shifted. The formula hasn't changed in their minds, but the world it was built for has. Now here's something really interesting that researchers have found. Baby boomers show significantly higher levels of what's called nostalgic idealization. In plain terms, they don't just remember the past fondly, they remember it as fundamentally better, safer, more moral, more disciplined. And this isn't just selective memory. Nostalgia actually activates reward centers in the brain. Remembering the good old days gives a genuine dopamine hit. So when a boomer says things were better back then, to them, neurologically, that feels completely true. And this nostalgia isn't passive. It shapes political views, parenting philosophies, opinions on culture, music, relationships, basically everything. The past becomes a psychological anchor in a world that's moving faster than any human brain was designed to process. Let's talk about something that rarely gets discussed, the midlife crisis, and why it hit boomers so hard. Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, a foundational framework in psychology, describes a stage called generativity versus stagnation. This is the phase where adults ask themselves, am I contributing something meaningful? Am I leaving something behind? Am I actually mattering? Baby boomers, with their intense work identities and high achievement orientation, often hit this stage and panicked, because the career was supposed to be the meaning, and sometimes it just wasn't enough. This is where you get the sports cars, the second marriages, the sudden spiritual journeys, the radical life pivots at 52. It's not a cliché. It's a developmental psychological crisis playing out in slow motion. And now, right now, boomers are entering the final chapters of Erikson's framework, the stage of ego integrity versus despair. This is where you look back at your life and either feel a sense of wholeness, I did what I came here to do, or you feel regret, disconnection, fear. Researchers are finding that boomers are experiencing this stage with unusual intensity, partly because they were the first generation to define themselves so completely through achievement, and now achievement is behind them. The psychological implications of this are massive. It explains the stubbornness, because admitting you were wrong about something feels like dismantling a lifetime. It explains the resistance to change, because change at this stage feels less like evolution and more like erasure. And it explains, honestly, some of the anger, because underneath the frustration there is often grief. Grief for a world that existed, for certainty that is gone, for youth that has passed. Here's what I want you to take from all of this. Every behavioral pattern that frustrates you about the older generation in your life, the rigidity, the silence, the back in my day, there is a psychological story beneath it, a real one, formed by real events, real fear, real survival. Understanding that doesn't mean you have to agree. It doesn't mean you accept harmful behavior, but it does mean you stop fighting a mystery and start engaging with a person. And honestly, some of their psychological strengths are things we desperately need right now. The ability to delay gratification, the resilience to function through discomfort, the commitment to building something that lasts. The most psychologically sophisticated thing you can do, at any age, is hold complexity. The boomers aren't heroes. They're not villains. They're human beings shaped by forces they didn't fully choose, just like you, just like me. And the moment you see them that way, the wall starts to come down.